So ends another adventure of the Good Hair Crew.
We're not the Good Hair Crew.
Yes, we are. The t-shirts have been ordered.
Hey everyone, Captain Sean here today with a special in-depth recap and review on the first season of Disney Channel's series Andi Mack, an incredible family-friendly series that breaks incredible new ground for the Disney company in a series full of genuine surprises, strong life lessons, humor, and lots of heart. I'll be looking at each episode one at a time, except for the first two episodes, which I'll review as one story since they were aired together, and I'll be recapping each episode's story and analyze all of the incredible themes that each story presented. So, let's not make this intro too long and get on with this special review, starting with looking at the first two episodes of this series.
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way, all the way.
The series begins with its focus on a young girl named Andi who lives a seemingly simple life with her friends and family in a seemingly simple, ordinary town. However, when Andi's young adult older sister Bex comes back after being gone for so many years to live with a family, that is where the real story begins. Now automatically, this show gets some good points from its portrayal of its main family. For one, Disney has finally created a TV family that's ethnically mixed. Plus, having one of the members of the family, Bex, be a young adult who seems a bit lost and is trying to find her way in the world is also very welcome, since that's the kind of character you usually never see portrayed in a Disney show. Now the first 15 minutes of the show are pretty simple. We find out Andi wants to buy a motorized scooter, she's got two friends she likes to talk about crazy stuff with, and there's a boy she has a crush on who wants her to join his ultimate frisbee team. It's pretty simple stuff, but even this kind of simple stuff is better quality than the majority of other new shows currently made by Disney today. There's no laugh track in this show, no over-the-top goofiness, no wacky shenanigans, and the humor present is pretty subdued. The story here really just feels like a slice of life from an actual real person's life. So you might be wondering, why watch a show that simply feels like it's just peering into the seemingly boring, ordinary life of a very ordinary girl? Well, that's where the later part of this premiere kicks in. A little bit after the 15-minute mark of the first episode, the story drops a huge bombshell on both the series' main protagonist Andi and the entire audience. Andi, who had never gotten to know her older sister Bex that well because she had been hanging out at questionable places and had a large number of boyfriends, uncovers a shocking revelation about Bex.
I'm not your sister. I'm your mother.
And from this point, the show suddenly becomes a whole different program than it was during the first 15 minutes. It now becomes a story about a young girl coming to grips with her entire viewpoint of what her family is, who her true mother is, and who she is. Now, the story of a teenager becoming a single mother is nothing new to television, but usually when you see that story showcased in television and movies, the focus and perspective is usually placed on what just the teenage mother is going through and how they feel, with the child simply just being there. This show, however, puts its emphasis on both the young parent and the child of the aforementioned young parent and all of the thoughts and feelings they're going through with the situation they have to live with, allowing the story to be incredibly relevant to both child and adult audiences. However, the plot point of Andi discovering Bex is her mother isn't the whole focus of this entire show. Andi is still seen dealing with everyday issues such as showing off her new scooter, joining an ultimate frisbee team, and her feelings towards a boy she likes. Plus, we get some scenes where Bex is seen trying to figure out a weird game the rest of the family is playing. These parts of the show that focus on the simpler issues may seem almost unnecessary to show compared to the bigger topic at hand. However, they do present one important fact to viewers watching. Single mothers and their children are still people with hopes and dreams that experience the same everyday trials and tribulations as all of us do. Unlike what most shows usually do that tackle the topic of single and teenage motherhood, Andi Mack actually takes its time to establish Bex and Andi as people first, and not just a single mother and their child. Now, one question that people that haven't watched this program yet might be asking is, who is this show for? Well, it is a family show, but it's not necessarily for young children. But the show does tackle its subject matter in a way that could be still viewed as appropriate for all ages, as long as parents are watching with any kids under 10. However, this is definitely a must-watch for any families that have any young single mothers and their children to watch together. Despite any negative feelings that one has on this topic, teenage motherhood is a real thing that does occur in our world. So for a mainstream show to give us a portrayal of how both a child and their young single parent can navigate through life and still grow as a family, that is something very welcome to see. And for those young viewers who aren't the children of single parents, they can still very easily relate to Andi's friends in the show who learn of the current situation by the end of the series premiere. Plus, there are some very nice family values present in the series premiere, and there is material here that any family could create a positive series of discussions out of. This series definitely did a very solid job at grabbing viewers' attention from the very beginning, and raised high hopes for where the show could go next, starting with the series' third episode.
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way, all the way.
Now in Andi Mack's third episode, we get a tale filled with multiple short stories that, while still short and simple, provide decent character drama and growth. The episode's main feature is Bex and her mother are experiencing conflict related to how to properly raise Andi. This leads to Bex showing Andi a scary movie in the hopes that it'll toughen her up a bit, but it of course causes Andi to be unable to think straight the next day and get a bit over-paranoid. Meanwhile, the episode also focuses on Andi's friends, Buffy and Cyrus, begin to discover their proper place in different sports teams. Now, many television shows that start with strong series openers have the tendency to drop a bit in quality after the first one or two episodes. And to be quite frank, that is seen in this third episode of the series, since this episode features several quick and much more simpler stories. However, you could argue that the format of this episode was necessary, as some of these short stories help establish the characters of Buffy and Cyrus more appropriately. You see, in the first two episodes, Buffy and Cyrus weren't necessarily completely fleshed out characters. They were more like literary appendages to Andi's character. They were simply people that Andi could react to in a way to establish her character. However, in this episode, we get to spend more time with Buffy and Cyrus and see who they are beyond their friendship with Andi in their simple but effective side stories. In Buffy's side story, we see her join the school track team. However, she becomes so completely absorbed with making herself look good that she forgets to work together with her teammates. This is a pretty simple story that's been done hundreds of times in kid shows before, but considering we live in a world now where an increasing percentage of children are becoming more selfish than ever, it's a nice moral that should never stop being shared. In Cyrus's side story, meanwhile, he finds more of a sense of belonging when he simply begins to bring water and sunblock to the players on the school sports team. And interestingly enough, Cyrus's simple acts of kindness do have a strong effect on the team's gameplay, since preventing dehydration and sunburns is important in any sport. So it's actually a much more unique story that shows young viewers that even if you aren't athletically gifted, you can still have a place in a sports enthusiast community. Now, the most mature story we get in this episode is when Bex tries to be more proactive with her role as Andi's mother. However, during her interactions with Andi during this episode, we see Bex is starting to act like she's back in her role of being Andi's older sister, such as giving Andi sweets, saying negative things about one of Andi's teachers, and showing Andi a movie that may be too mature for her. Now, this is a problem some young parents do go through, in the sense that many young adults treat young adulthood like it's a second childhood. They still casually eat junk food and pay little attention to how their words and choices can affect others, including, sadly, their children. However, by the end of the episode, we do see that Bex has realized that to be a true adult, and especially to be a true parent, you have to be more careful with your words and actions. However, this is all mixed in with the plot of Andi not thinking straight after watching a scary movie that Bex showed her, and that plot doesn't get well resolved. And that's mostly because this episode is a multi-plot overkill. It is very hard to fit 2 or even 3 plots into a half-hour show, so pushing to fit 4 into the series' third episode might have been going too far. However, the episode did provide viewers with much-needed stories that established Buffy and Cyrus's characters better, and it still had a positive tale involving Bex. It's just these stories were very short and somewhat simple. After a 2-part series premiere that was just so game-changing, so well-paced, and very profound, it would have been nice to have another well-told tale that had a better fleshed-out drama. However, as a simple half-hour of all-age-friendly drama mixed in with good life lessons, this delivers everything you need to entertain all members of the family.
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way, all the way.
Andi Mack continues its intriguing series in a much more straightforward story with plenty of great character moments, fine amounts of fun, and interesting mysteries. The episode's early focus starts with Andi and Bex's reactions to their entire community learning of their secret mother-daughter relationship. Basically, Cyrus blurted out the truth of Bex being Andi's mother to his own mother, who just happens to be the biggest gossip in town. However, even though the whole town learning of this secret greatly upsets Bex's mother, Celia, it actually allows Andi and Bex to become a bit more relaxed. Bex, especially upon learning that none of her or Andi's friends look down at her despite learning the truth now, allows Bex to feel more free to do things in her role as Andi's mother more out in the open. Which of course leads to Bex encouraging Andi to throw a giant party when Bex's parents are out of town. Now, similar to the previous episode, Bex is still exploring what it means to be a mother, as she still acts a bit like she's still in the role of Andi's older sister throughout this episode. You can tell that Bex is thinking more about what would be fun for Andi while they plan the party, versus considering the consequences of her actions, which is what a more mature parent would do. However, through everything she does, you can tell that Bex is growing up and becoming more mature in her role as a mother to Andi with each passing moment they're together. One simple example is when Andi walks down the stairs to her party and Bex sees Andi for the first time possibly ever in a dress. And through just the direction and the body language she makes, you can tell Bex is realizing, oh my gosh, I am actually the mother of not a little girl, but a young lady. Now, one of the two most notable themes in the episode is identity. Now, that can be first seen in the fact that Andi and Bex's identities related to who they are to each other are now revealed to everyone. But in another sense, the episode is about Andi and Bex exploring what their true identities are in respect to their friends and the community. Bex tries to display herself as the super cool and fun mom to everybody now. Meanwhile, Andi tries to be more proactive at being friendly and fun with her crush, Jonah Beck. However, there still is one missing component in how Andi views her new identity, and that relates to the mystery of what's going on in this episode. And interestingly enough, mystery is the other notable theme of the episode. The episode is entitled Dancing in the Dark because there's a nighttime dance party. Rather, it's because many of the characters are metaphorically dancing with many mysteries in their life being unsolved. Now, we're not talking about mysteries like why Jonah Beck goes out with that creepy girl Amber or why Celia doesn't like being called a grandmother. Those are questions that can be answered through what we've already discovered about their characters or through some of their subtle actions. What we're really talking about here is the big mystery that both Andi and the audience have no clue of how to solve on their own, and that is, who is Andi's father? Now, both Andi and the audience have no name or real backstory to work with. All we know is Andi's father might have come over to the place Bex was babysitting at when she was younger, and apparently he may actually know who Andi is. But aside from that, for both Andi and the audience, it's still pretty much a blank page. And unfortunately, that blank page is leaving Andi with a sense of unfulfillment with her identity. Now, Andi isn't looking for her father because she desperately needs a male role model in her life. She gets that from her grandfather. But rather, Andi needs to know where she comes from, what circumstances led to her being born, and she needs to understand the full past of both of her parents in order to truly contemplate how that is going to affect her future. However, those are questions that both Andi and the audience will have to wait a while to receive answers to. Overall, this episode works much better than the previous one. Rather than have multiple short stories, we instead get one straightforward tale that focuses well on two main characters, Andi and Bex. Both of the main actresses perform commendably. Peyton Elizabeth Lee does a terrific job at simply acting like a nice, realistic kid throughout the entire episode, while Leland Bowden, I'm hoping I'm saying the name right, is very commendable in her role as Bex as well. Not just through how she delivers dialogue, but also just how her facial expressions and subtle actions say so much in this episode as well. All the while, the supporting characters are used very effectively. Despite limited screen time, Lauren Thomas Celia is becoming much more entertaining to watch with some very funny moments from her. Plus, all of the other kids are starting to get some really solid, quick, funny moments in as well. Now, this episode by itself doesn't feel too groundbreaking, but it certainly does feel like a solid next step into where the overall larger story of this season is heading.
Yeah.
moves forward with its season-long plot in an interesting 5th episode that provides more interesting insights into the show's amazing characters. The episode focuses on Andi, Bex, Cyrus, and Buffy all growing as characters in 4 separate mini-stories. However, unlike the 3rd episode of the series, where having 4 stories occurring at the same time felt like multi-plot overkill, this episode actually balances things out much better. For one, the stories all build off previous events we've seen in the series. And second, these stories are all much more intertwined together from both a narrative standpoint and a thematic standpoint. The first story to note from this episode involves an altercation at school that causes Buffy to want to change the way her hair looks. However, Buffy has a hard time getting help with changing her hair since the only one in her family who apparently knows how to do hair well is her mother, who is currently not around in her life. Thus, Buffy feels like her needs as a growing young lady aren't being met, so Buffy goes to Bex for help with her hair. Meanwhile, Andi has now come to realize that despite Bex being her mother, still acts like an older sister. So, with the woman that Andi thought was her mom not being her mom, and her real mom not acting like a mom, and also not even knowing who her birth father is, it causes Andi to feel down. And with Bex spending time with Buffy, it causes Andi to feel like her own needs as a young lady growing up aren't being met as well. Although when Andi comes to understand why Buffy went to Bex for help, it reminds Andi that growing young ladies still need to be there for their friends, which helps them both move forward. Meanwhile, the other short story we get in this episode is about Cyrus going on a date with a girl named Iris. However, when the two double date with Jonah, Beck, and Amber, we see Cyrus get completely nervous and unable to think straight. Now, this little story isn't necessarily about creating a full plot that focuses on conflict and resolution. Rather, it's designed to establish Cyrus's character better, or more specifically, his character flaws. We learn in this episode that Cyrus has been raised by psychiatrist parents whose abilities to analyze people and situations have rubbed off on Cyrus in perhaps all the wrong ways, causing him to overanalyze situations in his own life in maybe not the best way. It's a little bit of info that hints that perhaps Cyrus himself feels like his needs as a young man growing up haven't been quite met either. Plus, Cyrus has a moment where he freaks out on a merry-go-round ride, which may or may not connect to some type of odd fear he has. It's hard to say too much else though, as this plot point isn't really resolved in the episode. However, another plot point that gets started in this episode but also doesn't get full resolution relates to Bex trying to contact Andi's father. Bex learns at the beginning of the episode that Andi's father is aware of who Andi is, but thinks Andi is Bex's sister, like everyone else had for so long. But since Bex is having a hard time talking to or even about Andi's father, it causes Bex to feel a disconnect for a while with Andi, connecting back to Andi's already mentioned feelings of disconnect with Bex in the episode. So, in order to confront these hard feelings she's going through, we get some scenes featuring Bex trying to send an online message to Andi's father in a series of moments that feature truly realistic and relatable emotions and actions. And throughout all of this, actress Leland Bowden continues to shine as she brings a pure honesty as to what a young adult in this situation truly would act like. Overall, this episode doesn't bring us full resolution to all of the conflicts the characters are experiencing, but as a piece to the larger season-long plot, this episode functions as a solid next piece to an amazing bigger picture.
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way, all the way.
In Andi Mack's 6th episode, we get a story that puts a spotlight on the character's flaws while still being a strong tale. The episode focuses on Andi, Celia, Buffy, and, interestingly enough, Jonah Beck, dealing with the issue of at what point should flaws in yourself and others be accepted, and at what point should flaws in yourself and others be labeled as a problem. The first notable story is Andi confronting Jonah about how she recently saw Jonah's girlfriend Amber on a date with another guy. And it's Jonah's reaction to the situation that for the first time in the show showcases him as a real human being. He admits to Andi in this episode that he knows Amber is insecure. However, he still wants to be the best boyfriend he can be to her and tries to hear her out. However, he still wants to be the best friend he can be to Andi and tries to hear her out too. All of this results, though, in Jonah feeling very conflicted. He is one of the kindest people ever, but he's finally starting to realize there is a point where one can be too kind to people, at least to selfish people, because there is a point where that selfish person is going to try to take advantage of your kindness. Meanwhile, Andi feels insecure about just telling Jonah what she saw, so she gets very nervous about going to school again and confronting him. Now, Andi's reaction is quite overdramatic in the story. However, it still brings up the question of, at what point should your personal flaws keep you from your friends and peers? Now, if one is dealing with a serious mental crisis, maybe they should take some time away from school and from their peers. But Andi honestly isn't experiencing a huge mental crisis that's super bad in this episode. Whether or not the way she talked to Jonah in this episode was flawed or not, that isn't the biggest concern in the world here. What Andi needs to realize is that her seemingly flawed way of talking to Jonah is not a big enough flaw to keep her away from him and school forever. Now, as this occurs, in a side story we get with Buffy, we see her being very competitive in track and field against another fast student. Now, as it was established in a previous episode, Buffy does not like losing, so she gets very annoyed when she finds out this other student is faster than her. Now, the conflict of this side story isn't really between Buffy and the other student, but rather between Buffy and herself. Buffy can't stand the idea of being less than perfect, so she can't stand the idea of having the smallest of small flaws in the situation, that being second fastest student in the school. But this brings up the question, should one let a flaw this small push oneself to super extreme lengths to be better? Meanwhile, we get another side story that seems to start out being focused on Bex, trying to be more responsible, such as buying the entire family their groceries and reorganizing some furniture in the house. But the real character focus here winds up being on Celia and how she views Bex in this scenario. You see, Celia is still not pleased with how Bex has turned out as an adult, since she still is a very flawed individual. However, in the story, we see the flaws that prevent Celia from saying that she is pleased with Bex are, Bex bought the wrong brand of food at the grocery store, and Bex spills over a drink in one scene. These are very small human flaws, and even though Bex does not deny that she has some flaws, she does confront Celia by pointing out she no longer has the flaw of being a jobless and negligent parent anymore. She is finally starting to act like a responsible mother, and is succeeding at a new career. So the question here is, when it comes to a struggling young single parent, at what point do you continue to nitpick at their flaws, and at what point do you just accept them as they are? Now, the only unfortunate thing about this episode is, there isn't much resolution. We don't see the characters necessarily grow much in this episode, we just see them experience new hardships and start analyzing the flaws in themselves and others around them. However, that aspect is also the episode's strength. Nobody is perfect, and most days of your life are not going to feature definitive resolution to all of your problems. And that theme continues into the very last scene of this episode, when Andi meets her father, Bowie. And Bex, without wasting any time, just point-blank tells Bowie that Andi is his daughter. Was just ripping away the secret faster than a Band-Aid the best move Bex could have made? Or was it a flawed one? At this point, it's hard to say. But even if it was a flawed action, like sometimes in life, this is going to have to be one of those flaws of life that now has to be accepted and lived with.
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way, all the way.
In Andi Mack's 7th episode, we get a story that features an unexpected but very interesting development. The main piece of the episode focuses on Andi and her father Bowie meeting each other for the first time and them spending their first day together as dad and daughter. Now for Andi, meeting her father is a big deal, but for Bowie, learning he has a daughter for the first time in his life is an even bigger bombshell. But surprisingly, Bowie takes all of this very well. Seriously, when Andi asks Bowie if he wanted to be a father, Bowie simply responds with saying that he believes the universe wanted him to be a father and accepts it. All of this is a surprising but very welcome turn of events. So many other drama shows, whether they be for kids, teenagers, or adults, take the story concept of a long-lost parent and just add lots and lots of serious drama to it, such as having the long-lost parent be a jerk, be super neglectful, or be just a flat-out antagonist to the main characters. Andi Mack, on the other hand, takes this entire concept in a completely different direction. Bowie is presented as a flawed character that's uncertain of what the next step he's supposed to take should be. But just like how Bex learned to embrace motherhood in the first episode, Bowie learns to embrace fatherhood in this episode. He doesn't just find out he has a kid and then runs off. He realizes he is a child now, understands he has to be a responsible role model to that child, and immediately sets out to do that. That is a very welcomed plot development to see here. What's also interesting about this episode is there is no real conflict in the main part of this story. The only established conflict here is what happened in the past, in that Bex and Bowie had a child before they were ready to be parents. The rest of the episode's concept is really just an excuse to let the characters breathe and get to know each other. Seriously, there is no serious conflict involved in the Andi and Bowie plot of this episode. For example, Andi wants to go talk to Jonah, and when she tells Bowie that she wants to talk to some boy she likes, Bowie doesn't get all angry that his daughter wants to go see a boy. He just drives her right over to where Jonah is. When Bowie asks Andi's school teachers if he can take Andi out of school to spend more time with his daughter he's just met, the teachers don't show any resistance to the idea. They understand the situation and support it. Even Bowie just trying to find some kind of fun activity for him and Andi to do. He doesn't just stand still for a long time, thinking really hard about what his daughter might like. He simply introduces Andi to a fun activity he likes, and the two wind up having fun together. While so many other TV shows would have taken the setup of this episode and gone in a much darker direction with it, it is very refreshing to see a series tackle the concept of a developing parent and child relationship in a very positive way. In American society today, parental neglect has become the biggest indirect cause of all sorts of problems with children and teenagers. And a lot of that stems from parents who have children, know they have children, but ignore their children's needs for their own selfish ends. But Bowie, on the other hand, acts completely unselfish in this episode, and every action we see him take is for Andi's benefit, seemingly. Now, that being said, Bowie still seems pretty unprepared to be a completely responsible parent. However, deciding whether you're ready or not to be a parent isn't the main point of this episode. The main point of this episode is, once you are a parent, you are one. So embrace it and do your best with it. And to see that kind of life lesson presented in any show, let alone a show that could be described as a kids program, is pretty amazing. Now, what happens next with Bowie and where the series goes with this plot could affect how one views this episode later down the road. And by the way, we'll save talking about Jonah's part in this episode for a later review where he'll probably get more screen time. But by itself, this episode of Andi Mack was an unexpectedly really good story.
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way, all the way.
Andi Mack's 8th episode provides viewers with an interesting episode that provides a solid next step for all of the characters' growth while still mixing in some true-to-life drama. The main piece to this episode revolves around Bowie trying to fit in with the lives of the Mack family. With no place to currently live at, Bowie is now temporarily living with Andi, Bex, and Bex's parents. This at first gets mixed feelings from the family. However, despite not currently having a steady job, Bowie does show that he has grown as a person since the family first got to know him many years ago. First, his cooking skills surprisingly win Celia over into letting him stay longer. And then we get a scene with Bowie and Bex just talking about their past and how Bowie does want to be a steady and supporting part of Bex and Andi's lives. And despite no serious commitment being made between the two, Bowie and Bex do take a believable first step in trying to reconnect with one another. But the real bulk of the story deals with how Andi reacts to Bowie trying to be a part of her life. Despite Andi and Bowie really getting along at first, some real drama does start to develop as Bowie becomes more and more involved in Andi's life, most notably Andi's social life, when he becomes the coach of Andi's sports team and begins to interact with all of Andi's friends. Now, it is very easy to see why Bowie wants to become more involved in Andi's life. The previous episode wasn't called Dad Influence because of how Bowie influences Andi, but rather how the concept of fatherhood influences Bowie. He now realizes the importance of being a responsible and caring parent in Andi's life and wants to be the best father he can be for Andi. However, Bowie's increased presence in everything Andi does causes Andi to feel very embarrassed and annoyed with Bowie. Now, it is very easy to argue that Bowie doesn't really do anything that truly embarrasses Andi. However, Andi is at an age where she's trying to assert her independence, and having her father become more entangled in everything about her life, including her social life, causes her to feel like she's losing her independence. So that's probably the real source of Andi's resentment towards Bowie in this episode. Now, in the only real side plot we get in this episode, Cyrus becomes very uncertain of his masculinity when a spelling mistake in a text from Jonah causes Cyrus to believe that Jonah thinks he's girly. In order to compensate for this seemingly loss of masculinity, Cyrus, with Buffy's help, tries to act more overtly masculine through how he dresses, changing how he greets people, and becoming more knowledgeable on all things sports-related. However, upon realizing that the message from Jonah was a mistake and that Jonah actually respects Cyrus, it causes Cyrus to become more comfortable with who he is. Essentially, Cyrus now realizes he doesn't have to act like one of the guys to be one of the guys. As it was already established in the third episode, Cyrus is liked and respected for how he helps people in ways that others don't consider. This episode, however, extends that message by explaining how it isn't how overtly or stereotypically masculine or feminine you are that is most important, but rather, it's the way you show kindness and positively impact others around you that is most important. And that's what ties both of these plots together thematically in this episode. Both Andi and Cyrus in the story are worried about how really minor things are going to embarrass them in this episode. However, they eventually realize that these factors don't have to take complete control of their lives. But sadly, Andi realizes this lesson perhaps too late. Because as soon as Andi realizes she should apologize to Bowie after getting mad at him for getting too involved in her personal life, she realizes that he's gone. How this impacts the next episode and the rest of the series, we'll just have to wait and see. Overall, this is a very solid episode. All of the middle school age characters act like very real middle school age characters considering what's going on here, and there's very appropriate growth on the side with how Bex and Bowie's relationship moves forward. Plus, the show continues to effectively make it very uncertain of what happens next with the season's overall story, which we'll be examining more closely next time.
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way, all the way.
Andi Mack's 9th episode provides a satisfying story that delivers an interesting next step in the character's journey that, while may leave viewers with more questions than answers, still provides intriguing story material. The story mainly focuses on Bex looking for ways to help out Andi. When Jonah asks Andi to help him find a birthday present for Amber, Bex uses it as an opportunity to turn showing off the makeup she wants to sell Jonah as an excuse to put makeup on Andi and make her look more attractive to Jonah. However, all of the time Bex is spending with Andi causes Celia to worry that Bex is influencing Andi perhaps too much, which results in a very tension-filled moment where it's accidentally blurted out that Bex didn't leave by choice when Andi was born, rather, Celia made her leave. Meanwhile, there's a small side story in the episode where Buffy thinks a boy at school, Marty, stole one of her running shoes, so she gets back at him by ruining his running shoes. Now, aside from the small shocking bits of detail we get related to Bex's backstory in this episode, this sadly isn't a story where that much is learned or that much growth is gained. However, there still is some story material here to analyze. First off, when Jonah is talking to Andi about the present he bought for Amber, he mentions how whenever he messes up, Amber gives him second chances, which is similar to how he gave Amber a second chance 2 episodes prior. The reasoning behind why giving someone a second chance is so important to Jonah is unclear, but it makes one wonder. What past events would cause Jonah to give someone more second chances than they really deserve to redeem themselves? Now, there still is some definitely solid themes in the story. Andi, Celia, Buffy, and Bex are feeling like they've been wronged by someone in the episode. Andi feels like in the story that Jonah isn't really properly paying attention to her, only to have her not really pay attention to him at the end of the episode. Celia feels like Andi and Bex are being rude to her, but she only comes across as rude to them. Buffy believes she's been hurt by another student in the episode, only to have her hurt that student herself. And of course, Bex feels like she's been treated in an uncaring way by her mother, only to have her at the end of the episode move into a new apartment without any care on her part related to what her mother thinks she's doing. It's a solid thematic message that shows viewers if you're not careful and truly considerate of how your actions affect others, you may become the very thing you yourself distaste. Overall, not too much happens in this episode, but just enough interesting stuff occurs to leave you satisfied with this story, and you're left with just enough questions that leaves you really wanting to come back to watch this series even more.
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way, all the way.
In the 10th episode of this series, Home Away from Home, we finally get a story that features some sense of resolution and really solid growth for the characters in a tale that's pretty simple and yet very much profound. Now, with the premise and setup for the episode, there isn't much to say. Bex now has her own apartment, and Andi is living with her. But Bex is having a hard time doing all of the basic things that both the role of a homeowner and a single mother demand of her. Now, the situation may seem like just an excuse for some very sitcom-like moments to occur, and at first it does. Andi's pants are washed with a lip balm by accident, Bex walks around like a zombie while trying to get coffee ready, and there are electrical problems where they live. But this is all countered when it's all followed up with an actually well-placed dramatic story instead. As one with common sense would know, being both a homeowner and a single parent for the first time is very difficult. Trying to manage a large number of appliances while trying to still care for the physical and emotional needs of your child is very time-consuming, and there is no quick fix to solve all of the difficulties that you'll face. And you can tell this entire situation in the episode is frustrating to Bex. She does want to be a good mother, she does want to provide for her child, and she does want to be independent and responsible. However, because of her limited funds, she's wound up with only being able to afford an apartment with lots of broken appliances and electrical issues. She does want to give her daughter more things and more space to call her own because she's an adolescent that deserves that space, but Bex can't because of the size of her living conditions. Now, it is sad to see Bex so frustrated with her situation in the story, and yet this is the situation you'd expect considering her backstory and the decisions she's made. So, this results in both Bex and Andi considering if Andi or both of them should move back in with Bex's parents. And this is where we get some of the very solid moments with Celia in the episode. In the series' first scenes to ever feature just the grandparents alone, we learn Celia isn't just mad that Bex and Andi moved out, but also legitimately very saddened. She is worried that their basic needs aren't being met, but on an even more emotional level, she doesn't feel like she has a place in their lives anymore. Now, Andi and Bex do start to come by a few times to the old house, but it's really just to get a few of Andi's old things, have Andi do her laundry there, and get Andi some more food. But despite still needing some help and wanting the family to stay connected, Bex still wants to try to be Andi's sole caretaker now. But then we get to a point where Bex realizes she can't provide Andi a cooked meal one night. And that is when Bex gives up on the idea that she is fit to be Andi's mother. So Bex brings Andi back to Celia, asking Celia to take care of her daughter. Now, this isn't because Bex wants to be neglectful to Andi, but rather it's because Bex wants to give Andi the best life possible. And the best life Andi can get right now is from her grandparents. But then in a clever plot twist, Celia actually takes Andi back to Bex's apartment. Despite the mixed feelings everyone has about the situation, everyone does agree that Bex is Andi's mother. And despite how flawed Bex and her home environment is, the one place Andi should be now is with Bex, flaws and all. Andi's grandparents will still be a part of their lives, which is clearly seen when Celia gives Bex a better brand of laundry detergent. But when it comes to where Andi's real home now is, this story affirms how that home will now be wherever Bex is. And this is only affirmed to the end of the episode when Andi looks at Bex and says right to her face for the first time ever that she really is her mom. Home Away from Home provides one of the most solid stories yet for the series. While many other episodes were just designed to serve to the series' larger story arc, this is the first episode to feature a basic conflict at the start of the episode that gets resolved at the end, but still leaves things open for plenty of good story material later down the line. Now, there is a side story with Cyrus and Buffy that, while decent enough, feels like the most disconnected side story yet for the series. Aside from letting the audience know that Cyrus admires Jonah since Jonah is the only male friend Cyrus has, the tale only seems to really serve the need of reminding us that these other characters exist. But the situation with Andi and Bex is where the great story material comes from. Their situation is very simple and domestic-oriented, however, it deals with simple and domestic issues that so many people deal with, thus making it a lot more relatable to a greater number of people. The story doesn't need an antagonist or a large-scale conflict, the conflict just comes from life happening. This is the situation the characters are in, and they just need to find a way to deal with it. But there's no perfect way to deal with it. Is it more important for a child to be with those that can provide more for them? Or should they stay with their flawed parent? At what point should a parent's flaws be so great that they give their child away to somebody else? And at what point should certain flaws just be tolerated so that the child and parent can stay together? And how much space should a single parent trying to raise their kid be given? And how much assistance is appropriate to provide them? These aren't easy questions to answer. However, this episode of Andi Mack does a very solid job at putting all the cards on the table and shows viewers of all ages this is what you'll have to deal with if you ever land in a kind of situation like this yourself one day. And for those people out there that are maybe dealing with similar problems to the ones seen in this episode, this story shows some believable outcomes that could happen if you make similar choices yourself. Overall, well-written, well-paced, and of course, well-performed episode. Peyton Elizabeth Lee continues to deliver a solid and realistic performance in a role that she clearly owns now, and Leland Bowden and Lauren Tom give award-deserving performances that convey plenty of emotion through both well-said dialogue and well-timed body language. If this had been the season finale, this would have been a nice note to end things on. As long as we know there'd be a second season, which there will be, but luckily, there's still more amazing stories to come in this amazing series.
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way.
In the 11th episode of the Andi Mack series, we get a story that gives us the biggest shift in narrative standpoint for the show thus far, in a tale that while is a bit jarring in respect to the rest of the series, still is a solid story. The episode focuses on Andi and her friends dealing with a new school principal who's trying to implement an unfair dress code for the students. So in an attempt to express how they feel like their freedom of expression is being oppressed, Andi and friends lead many of the students in the school in a big protest. Now, the first odd thing about watching this episode is, it is very standalone. The story doesn't build off any past episodes, and the main plot doesn't feel like it's going to feed into any future ones, which would be fine if that's what most episodes of the show were like. But they're not. Andi Mack is a serialized show, and the main plot of every episode before the story fed into the season-long story arc. This episode, however, feels like it was written by someone who barely saw the first episode, wrote the story, and then a quick rewrite was done right before the episode was filmed. I mean, seriously, the episode doesn't even reference Andi now living with Bex, or even Bex being Andi's mother. But with all that being said, by itself, this is actually a very solid story. The idea of how strict a school dress code should be has been debated for decades now, and there still isn't a happy middle ground that all counties and school districts have come to. But it's the principal's reasoning for implementing the strict dress code that's the most interesting aspect of the story's specific situation. The principal in the story implements the stricter dress code because students' grades have gone down recently and the school is now not one of the top 3 best performing schools in the area, but it's still in the top 10%. So, in a quick-ditch attempt to improve things, the principal, without any true research to back himself up, assumes dress attire is the sole reason student grades have suffered. And as someone who has worked in schools and childcare settings for over 10 years, I just have to say right now that this principle is more realistic than some people might care to admit. Now, just to be clear, not all school leaders are like this principal. However, I have encountered many childcare leaders over the last decade who have quickly jumped to the conclusion that simple aesthetics are what lead to a child's undesirable behavior, instead of maybe examining the school's teaching styles, behavior management techniques, school day structures, and additional outside influences. And this type of unfair jumping to conclusions can affect teachers as well. Seriously, years ago I got a serious speaking to because one day at work I decided to wear 2 watches on my arms. But fortunately I can say I see a lot of this less nowadays. We live in a world full of so many large-scale problems that simple variations in dress attire aren't the biggest deal anymore. I live for the day that simple variations in dress attire are the biggest problems schools face, but until that day comes, all educators really need to focus on the bigger behavior and educational issues and just put everything else on the back burner for a while. Now, the only real thing that affects the series overall in this episode are the interactions between Andi and Jonah. In the episode, Jonah doesn't join Andi's protest, which Andi doesn't get that upset about. But when Andi doesn't come ready for something related to Jonah's sports team that she's on, Jonah does get upset at Andi. And this is the moment that Andi realizes her entire friendship with Jonah has been based around things he likes and things he wants to do. Andi has done so many things to support Jonah and help him out, and not gotten much in return. So she walks away from Jonah near the end of the episode, seemingly breaking off her friendship with him. Now, one could argue, Andi may not have given Jonah a good chance to show support for something Andi does like. This was the first time Jonah shrugged off something Andi asked him to do. Maybe he deserves a second chance. However, Jonah has given Amber second chances, perhaps one time too many, And maybe that means someone with Jonah's judgment isn't best for Andi. What happens next between these characters, though, we'll just have to wait until the next episode to see. But for now, overall, this was an episode that, while may stick out from the rest of the series in a negative way, still presents a well-done and smart story.
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way.
In the Season 1 finale of Andi Mack, we get a tale that showcases just how far the characters have come while new story arcs for the next season begin. The episode focuses on 3 plot lines that have been developing all season. Buffy's tough competitive streak she's been having with a boy from her school, Marty, Jonah's conflicting relationship with Amber, and the odd but developing family dynamic occurring with Andi, Bex, and Bowie. Now, with Buffy's side story in the episode, it's pretty simple. Buffy is enjoying the idea of having a race with Marty. However, as the big race approaches, she finds herself dreading it. Why? Well, it's because Buffy finally realizes in this episode that it's not necessarily the sense of winning she enjoys, but rather the sense of competition. Although, one could argue this is simply Buffy starting to grow into becoming a better friend, someone who focuses more on playing games with peers rather than completely focused on victory. Now with Jonah, we finally get some much needed development for his character. After losing his relationship with Andi, we see Jonah now left with just Amber by his side. And it's only at this point that Jonah finally sees the hollow nature of his relationship with Amber. So Jonah finally decides to break up with her. Now this could be seen as Jonah deliberately paralleling what Andi did with him. In the previous episode, Andi broke off her relationship with Jonah because she felt like their entire relationship was Andi doing things for Jonah and not getting much support in return. Jonah in this episode realizes his entire relationship with Amber was him doing things for her and not getting much support from her in return. Now there are obviously major differences between Jonah and Andi and Jonah and Amber. Jonah and Andi had some level of respect for each other. However, it's really hard to pinpoint exactly why Amber wanted to date Jonah in the first place. I mean, she is older than him. Although one could argue that since Amber is very possessive and controlling, she could be going after a younger guy because she feels like her status allows her to have more power and influence over Jonah. This can definitely be seen when seconds after Jonah breaks up with Amber, Amber seems shocked since she seems to assume that her age and status should be a factor in ensuring Jonah would never want to break up with her. But thankfully, all the power and influence she can muster doesn't win Jonah back. How this affects Amber as a character going forward, and how Jonah is now going to move forward himself following these events, is something we're just going to have to wait and see play out in Season 2. Meanwhile, in the most prominent plot of the episode, we see Bowie coming back to town and how Andi and Bex react to that. Bowie had indeed been on the road for a while to give Andi some space after her outburst at him several weeks prior. But after Bowie finds several pictures of Bex at clubs that she herself had previously visited on the road, Bowie takes it as a divine sign to come back and win Bex over, which starts when Andi invites Bowie over to have dinner with herself and Bex, resulting in, for the first time ever, Andi having a fun family night with just her mom and dad. A night that ends with Andi giving Bex and Bowie some alone time, as they find themselves happily dancing together. Now this of course leads Andi to wanting to play matchmaker with her two parents. However, it isn't going to be easy. Bex truly believes that Bowie, while being fun to hang out with, isn't a dependable guy. But Bex does admit to Andi that she does love Bowie. And being an excited middle school age girl, Andi obviously tells Bowie in private later that Bex does indeed love him. And Bowie admits to Andi that he does have strong feelings for Bex. However, Bowie is smart enough to realize that it's going to take more than one fun evening to convince Bex that he can become a dependable man, so he begins making a long-term plan to do so. But when Bowie stumbles upon a ring and a suit that he plans to buy at a used clothes store, Bowie and Andi suddenly realize that this may be fate's way of telling Bowie that his long-term plan to win Bex over should also include asking Bex to marry him. How this long-term plan turns out, though, we'll just have to wait and see, as Season 2 of this amazing series plays out. Now when it comes to my overall thoughts on Andi Mack Season 1, I just have to say that this show has easily become one of the greatest family programs of all time. It featured relatable characters experiencing real life and learning real life lessons that real life audience members could apply to their own real lives. And yes, there was smart relatable stuff for kids, But easily the powerful, groundbreaking material here was the stuff adult audiences could relate to, especially with Bex and her character's growth. Now, while a young single mother character isn't anything new to television, what makes this program so original and yet so relatable is how Bex is presented in the show. You see, in many other TV shows, we see the mothers in those programs at a time where they have already accepted their roles as mothers for quite some time. Thus, we miss the early years of when they first took on their roles. But then in contrast, way too many other shows, especially those aimed at teens along with soap operas, use a young woman suddenly becoming a single mother at a young age as just a means to create more drama. And even worse, shortly after the kid is born, we barely ever see them again. Seriously, way too many TV writers give their teenage and young adult character a kid or two, and then the kids are almost never seen again. What makes Andi Mack such a unique show, however, is we get an actual tale of a young woman beginning her journey of wanting to become a true parent to her child from the ground up. And of course in this show, we also get to see via Andi a child's truly fleshed out reaction to being born to a teenage mother and how that affects her. This show works because it looks at the actual realistic actions and consequences that both parent and child in this type of family experience from the very beginning, followed by every realistic step thereafter. The show is both realistic and optimistic at the same time. The show's starting point is that of an all-too-relatable nowadays dysfunctional family, but the show's hope and optimism springs in when it shows how people from a dysfunctional family and difficult situation can realistically turn their life around and improve things for themselves and their children. And realistically is the strong word here. Almost no family-related problems in this series work themselves out in just one half-hour story. Everything takes time to improve in the show. And of course, all this is brought to life by probably one of the most stellar groups of writers, directors, and casts ever. The writers during most episodes knew exactly how to pace their comedy and drama, and knew exactly how to keep viewers coming back for more each week. Plus, they masterfully tied multiple plots that would be occurring in the same episode with each other thematically almost all of the time. The directors were also amazing at making every story feel like a real slice of life, and the actors just felt tailor-made for these roles. It's hard to pick a favorite actor in this show because, seriously, no one is bad here, trust me. But if I had to pick one, I'd give the Season 1 Best Acting Award to Leland Bowden for her portrayal of Bex. True, she was given a character with the most complex growth to go through by the writers, but this is the one actor in the show who did nothing but impress me with every scene she was in. From the way she said her goofier lines, to the way her tone of voice would change when needed, to her facial expressions, to her simple body language that conveyed more than her dialogue at times. Yeah, Leland Bowden by far is one of the best actresses ever right now. And please nobody bash me for not naming the other actors because they are all truly awesome. Lauren Thomas Celia delivers her dialogue and does many subtle things in her acting incredibly well too. Sophia Wiley and Joshua Rush are also incredibly fun to see perform in any scene they are in. And Asher Angel too always brings a positive light whenever he's on screen. And Peyton Elizabeth Lee completely owns her character and the show now. And now that the series has had one season to get its feet moving, it's going to be incredibly fascinating to see how this show really starts running when it moves into its second season, which we'll obviously be getting into at some point in the future.
Wow.
Disney Channel's breakout hit of the year returns.
Andy, that's so exciting. You're nervous?
Things are different now.
Andi Mack is back.
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way, all the way.
Disney's new hit TV series, Andi Mack, starts its second season off on a very high note, with a well-presented hour-long story that finds time to share the spotlight between its ensemble cast of characters, all the while continuing and improving upon the series' consistent strength of showcasing true-to-life situations with excellence. The new season's premiere primarily functions as a means to kickstart multiple story arcs that feature major turning points for the majority of the characters. Now, if there's one word that could be used to describe all the characters' journeys in this premiere, it would be the word confusion. The episode features many of the characters trying to take steps to grow into the next phase of their lives, but are all uncertain about how to do it right. However, this isn't showcased as a means to try to make the characters seem dumb or to make the show talk down to its audience. Rather, it's done in a way that realistically shows how it can be difficult for many individuals of different ages and backgrounds to find the right way to take the appropriate next steps to growing up. The first and most focused upon of these scenarios is the situation of whether Bowie will ask Bex to marry him. Bowie obviously wants to be a permanent part of Bex and Andy's lives, but isn't sure of how to proceed with making that happen. But the other side of the situation is whether Bex would say yes to Bowie's potential marriage proposal, along with the fact that not only is the audience uncertain about what Bex really wants, but Bex herself is still trying to figure out what she wants. And that is very understandable. She has only just started to get used to her role of being Andy's mother and primary provider. Now, Bex, like anyone, probably wants a traditional happy family for herself and Andy one day, but it's obviously hard for her to want to bring in any other type of major change into her life right now, since so much in her life has already been turned upside down, which is probably why, when the marriage proposal finally happens, Bex decides to say no to Bowie. Meanwhile, the season premiere also focuses on Andy and Jonah finally becoming a couple. Seriously, once broken up with Amber, Jonah finally sees the obvious light that both Andy and the audience clearly saw all of season 1. So after letting Andy know how much he really likes her, but without pushing her to like him back, which was a nicely done move, he and Andy start the basic beginnings of a stronger relationship. However, Andy quickly learns that getting this dream turned into a reality isn't what she expected. She finds herself even more nervous now, since the emotions that come from being somebody's girlfriend are brand new to her and she's unsure of how to handle them. It's a nice little nod to reality in the sense that for anyone, not all situations turn out the way we thought they would in real life. And speaking of things not turning out the way anyone thought, Amber is back in this premiere, and for the first time ever, she acts nice. Now, some new information is learned about her in this episode, such as Iris telling the gang that Amber has always been insecure, and Amber even revealing privately to Jonah at one point that another part of the reason why she's been a jerk for so long is because her dad lost his job and has been out of work for some time, which has obviously had a negative impact on the family. Now, whether Amber is lying or not is still left uncertain by the end of the episode. Unlike the uncertainty that comes from what all the other characters are going to do next in the show, Amber's true intentions and future actions are now the only true mystery the series has at this particular point. And thanks to both the writing, direction, and actress Emily Skinner's performance, it truly is very difficult to pinpoint what she's really up to and what's going to happen next. And that's exactly how good television storytelling should be done. Things in the real world can be unpredictable at times, and that's what the series showcases very well. And speaking of the real world, it's time to move on to the big topic in this episode. That being Cyrus being gay. Now, the revelation isn't just spouted out. What the show cleverly does first is give Cyrus what he seemingly wanted for some time, a girlfriend who finally kisses him and shows him unconditional affection. But when Cyrus starts realizing that he's experiencing feelings of jealousy from seeing Andy and Jonah get back together, Cyrus only now starts to realize that he isn't sure that he wants Iris anymore, but rather wishes he had Jonah. Essentially, just like many of the other characters in this episode, Cyrus is very confused about what he wants now. But for Cyrus more than anyone else, his change in decision of what he wants has obviously resulted in a massive change in his identity. Now, obviously, this major change in Cyrus's character has resulted in a massive response from many different types of people online. Some loving that this type of story is happening in a Disney show, some hating it, and some liking the idea but think it doesn't belong in a kid's show. But here's the thing. Andi Mack from the get-go has been a series that showcases what real people, including kids, in the real world deal with. For example, the series from the beginning has tackled the topic of teenage pregnancy. Now, one could easily argue this is not a topic that should be addressed on a television program that is being watched by millions of kids. But the thing is, this is a topic that millions of kids in the real world do deal with. They either are or know someone that is the child of a teen parent. It's not a thing that should be glorified, but it's a real thing that happens in the real world, and how to navigate through that type of living situation, or how to assist people you know going through that type of living situation, is a topic that everyone should be familiar with, because unless you're going to be a hermit for the rest of your life, you will encounter someone in the situation at some point. So you should have some idea of how to react to it appropriately when it happens. Similarly, encountering individuals who are gay is a part of the real world. To act like it isn't would make the show become more fantasy than realistic. And as much as some people might hate to admit it, not addressing the topic can do more harm than good. You see, not letting children know about what groups of people different than themselves or their family are like can cause very negative consequences later down the line. For example, if a child from a family of one particular religion is just told that all other faiths are wrong and nothing else, it can cause that child to grow into an adult that simply hates individuals that have different beliefs. However, if that child is told of the differences and similarities that different religions and faiths have, it can help them find ways when they're older to create simple friendships, or at least find simple common ground in building relationships with those of different backgrounds. The same can be said with getting to know people from different cultures or countries. You cannot ignore the differences, but to ignore the similarities that can bring us peacefully together, that can be designated as the greater crime. The exact same type of thing can be said with those that are gay and those that have no interest in being that. Now, this isn't to say that all lifestyle choices people make are right and should be glorified. To say that everyone is right and no one is wrong would result in a world with nothing but chaos and no order. However, as Andi Mack showcases, the world is not going to get better by creating more conflict from people fighting over differences. First and foremost, we all need to love and help our neighbors. Maybe not help them in things we disagree on, but help them in things we have in common. This is definitely seen with the character of Cyrus. If he just showed up in the first episode as the gay person that's only there to remind you he's gay, that could cause some audiences to instantly dislike him. But from early on, that's not how he was presented. He was introduced as a supportive friend that finds creative ways to help people first and foremost. Thus, if you ever met Cyrus in real life, but didn't approve of him crushing on Jonah, you could still appreciate him for being kind to his friends and the sports team he supported, and you could find common ground to bond with him from there. You can go through life not approving everything your peers do, but you can still find something to appreciate in them, and even still find something to build some sort of friendship out of. And these are the kind of conversation topics that could potentially come from families watching this show together. And yes, this is truly a TV show that families need to watch together. Whether you approve of gay lifestyle choices or not, this is the type of show that can be used as a true opportunity to start springboarding conversations parents can have with their kids about whether this type of lifestyle choice is right, or why it's wrong, or at the very least, how to appropriately go about interacting and still showing kindness to those that are different than you. Because to not do so can result in many young people later down the line becoming uninformed individuals that make hateful and harmful choices that cause great damage to many people. So yeah, for anyone who thinks Andi Mack is doing harm to young viewers with what they're showing, well, I hope you don't mind what the real world is showing them, because it's pretty much the same thing. But in a confused world full of flawed people, it is good to know that there's one TV show out there that is trying to make an attempt to show how a flawed world can be a little better.
Puffy, I feel weird. Different.
You've always been weird, but you're no different.
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way.
In the second episode of its second season, Andi Mack delivers another solid step in both the series' overall story and its standard of quality family entertainment. The main part of the episode revolves around drama that both family and friends experience on the day of Chinese New Year, along with the holiday itself. Now, first off, Just as the previous episode worked on one type of representation, this episode works on another, that being cultural representation via traditions associated with Chinese New Year. Now, unlike some educational shows out there that try to hammer in the history behind a holiday and its traditions via tons of exposition, this episode features the Mack family acting very matter-of-fact and very casual about everything, since this is obviously nothing new to them. However, when Andi invites Jonah to spend Chinese New Year with her family, through him, any audience members who are not Chinese or unfamiliar with that culture are able to learn a few new things via his loose educational journey. Now, while this is all going on, there's a side story in the episode about Buffy wanting to join the boys' basketball team at school, since there's no girls' basketball team. Now, there are many things that can be said about the situation. First off, one can make the argument that this story does a decent job at addressing gender equality and shows that girls should be allowed to do the same thing that boys can do. But what this plot point also addresses are realistic complications that come from sports teams and schools. First off, the school in the story is said to have never had a girls' basketball team. And while this is strange to see in such a large public school, it's not unheard of. And even more important, it's hard in any school to start a new sports team when there's been no precedent of it. And also, when it gets to middle school and definitely high school, having a gender-mixed sports team is a tricky situation. On one hand, you do want to see gender equality. On the other hand, it can be difficult in a mixed-gender sports game where players are constantly in such close physical proximity to each other, which can result in a situation where two players of opposite genders find themselves bumping into each other a lot. And that can result in either party getting uncomfortable or accusing the other of doing something inappropriate. However, going with the theme of the main part of the story, representation matters, and Buffy should be allowed to play basketball in some fashion. However, the solution to helping her find some type of way to play basketball on some type of professional team is still going to be tricky. Meanwhile, the main emotional aspects of the episode focus on everyone dealing with the effects of Bex not wanting to marry Bowie. Now, there's definitely a sadness to it all because not just Andi, but nearly everyone else now seems to be very pro the two getting together. However, the story here reminds audiences that when it comes to marriage, it really is a choice that revolves around the decisions of just two people, in this case, Bowie and Bex. And while Bowie is very much on board with marriage, sadly, Bex is not. And for Bex, this is very understandable. Her life over the last few months has resulted in many changes. So for her, it's hard to want to let in a new factor that could result in even more changes. And as the end of the episode reminds viewers, Bex still hasn't told everyone the full story of what she's been through over the last 13 years. And if one can't be honest about their journey in the past, then how can they properly move forward with a brand new one in the future?
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way, all the way.
In Andi Mack's latest episode, we get a series of short stories that focuses on the theme of moving forward from the past, even if it can be difficult in the present. The most notable of these stories first involves Andi dealing with Amber being suddenly very nice to her and trying to figure out what this means. On one hand, Andi and friends have to deal with the possibility that Amber may not be over Jonah and is trying to get close to Andi so that she can, in a deranged way, be closer to Jonah. However, on the other hand, Andi has to deal with the possibility that Amber may be trying to be a better person and Andi may be allowing her emotions to not show kindness to a seemingly lonely person that is in need of a friend. By the episode's end, it still isn't fully revealed where Amber's mindset is. Andi's, however, is when she shows a basic act of friendship by the end of the episode with Amber. Meanwhile, Cyrus has to deal with moving forward with where his mind and heart are when he has a date with Iris. Cyrus, who has previously put a lot of time into his relationship with Iris, is having great difficulty at showing any desire to break up with her.
I'm sorry.
For what?
That was terrible.
It'll get better.
No, it won't.
But meanwhile, at the same time, Bex is having great difficulty at admitting to Andi and acknowledging her past romance with a guy named Gabriel. Even though the details aren't revealed, it is clear to see that Bex doesn't want to put this guy's picture in her box of past boyfriends because those are individuals she's put behind her, and this mystery guy isn't. And just as it can be with many individuals, Andi predicts with Bex that one of the reasons why she can't move forward properly with her own future is that she hasn't put the past completely behind her. Now, the episode also features a side plot about Buffy trying out and making it on the boys' basketball team. And while it doesn't seemingly tie into the theme that the other stories feature, it actually sort of does. You see, in any scenario where there isn't a precedent for what's come before, it can be hard to move forward with your objective. In this case, the school featured here has never had a girls' basketball team. And while that is rare for a major public school nowadays, it's still not unheard of. If no one steps up and starts one, there will be none. And sadly, with preteens and teenagers, it can be difficult to be the first one to do something when it comes to anything. So even though Buffy isn't trying to work past difficulties she herself has faced in the past, she instead is facing preconceived notions that many other people have had about how things in the past should work. Overall, while this episode of Andi Mack acts more as a starter for several plot lines rather than featuring solid plots on its own, it does continue to do one of the things that the series has always been good at. That being, tying seemingly separate plots together to the same themes, thus showing viewers of all ages that whether you're a kid, teenager, or adult, we all deal with the same types of issues at all ages in life. And no matter what age you are, life will always have its challenges. But don't forget that you don't have to deal with those issues all on your own.
Buffy, am I gonna be okay? Cyrus, you already are okay.
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way, all the way.
In this latest episode of Andi Mack, we get a story that, while finally providing some great backstory on the Mack family, also provides a tale of how holding on to one point of view without thinking about how others may see you can lead to negative consequences. The main part of the episode focuses on Andi and Bex helping Celia clean the house. However, digging through mementos of the past causes memories of the past to fully resurface, most notably, memories of what led Bex to leaving Andi with Celia many years ago. The thing is, though, both Bex and Celia seem to remember these events differently. Bex recalls Celia being extremely critical of every mistake Bex was making, while Celia remembers Bex being very irresponsible. The thing is, though, despite these flashbacks seemingly being in conflict with each other, they actually do fit together. You see, there's been more than enough evidence in the series thus far to say that Bex does have a history with being irresponsible and not making the best choices. Thus, all of Bex's many irresponsible choices, most notably becoming pregnant with Andi before she was ready, would cause Celia to become very critical of her. This is especially true when you come to realize that, for Celia, witnessing Bex making so many mistakes would undoubtedly cause her to question where she went wrong as a mother, and all that frustration would cause her to become more harsh in her interactions with Bex. So, while the flashbacks Bex and Celia do have in this episode might be skewed a bit, it's equally valid that both flashbacks did happen exactly as they both remember, but at different times. However, this does lead to a flashback moment that both Bex and Celia both seem to agree did indeed happen when Andi was just a few months old, when both Bex and Celia have an argument that goes on for over half an hour but causes them to both forget where they had left Andi. And this causes both individuals, but perhaps more so Bex, to realize that the two fighting constantly will only lead to Andi eventually getting hurt. And that's when Bex left. It was one major event, but it was viewed in two different ways. To Celia, this was Bex just being irresponsible again. But for Bex, this was a sacrifice. For Bex, she wanted to spare Andi the experience of two things. One, being raised by a mother who wasn't completely ready to be one, and the other being the experience of being raised by a mother who would be constantly told by her own mother that she was not up to the task. And seeing Andi actually say her first word, mama, to Celia, and not her, just causes Bex, who already feels like she's completely irresponsible, to feel driven away to leave Andi with the woman who seems more capable of being that to her. And this is something that could realistically happen in our current culture today. Too often, many people, even those with the best intentions, can become so obsessed with just their point of view that they fail to try to take others' points of view around them. And this isn't an issue of what is right and what is wrong. It's the issue of just taking a moment to think about how another person may be viewing you or the same situation you're witnessing, and how that can greatly impact how you then interact with that person. In this story, we now realize that Celia simply had the intention to help give Bex and Andi a better life. But Celia's inability to see how Bex perceived her caused her to unintentionally come across as rude and critical to Bex. And while Bex was indeed irresponsible during her teenage years, she still had every intention to try to be a good mother to Andi. But Bex's inability to try to see how Celia perceived her caused her to feel disconnected from her own mother and felt driven to leave. And this leads to the importance of communication, and not just shouting out your inner thoughts with people around you, but real communication. When you talk, but also listen, and then reflect on what others have said and how they interacted with you. Another great example of this is in the side plot of the episode, with Buffy playing cards with her elderly neighbor. Buffy's neighbor, like her, is obsessed with winning, but when Buffy realizes that her neighbor's obsession with winning caused her friends and family to not want to be around her anymore, it causes Buffy to finally reflect on what others have said about her in the past and how they interacted, which leads Buffy, for the first time in her life, walking away from a game, not caring if she won or not. Despite this episode of Andi Mack feeling quite short and not giving viewers as much flashback material as they might have wanted on the Mack family, it does still present great character drama and a great life lesson. For so long, Bex and Celia kept shouting their thoughts at the other without really listening to each other. But now, they are finally willing to hear the other out, which hopefully will help the two finally be able to help each other more and grow in the future. And if you yourself are experiencing some sort of crisis or helping someone else with their crisis, don't forget that communication is key.
I trusted you because I knew how much you loved her.
That was an amazing sacrifice you made. I don't think I could have made it. You've never said that before.
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way.
In this latest episode of Andi Mack, we get an interesting tale that tackles not just the concept of kindness to those that you're having issues with, but also the concept of how someone's behavior can change, and if it can change. The main part of the episode starts with Andi overhearing Amber talking on the phone with her family, and during this, Andi learns that Amber's parents have been fighting so much recently that Amber doesn't feel comfortable going home. So, in order to help Amber out, Andi actually allows Amber to sleep over at her place. Now, obviously many of the other characters are worried about the negative consequences that could come from having Andi allow Amber to get close to her. Amber obviously has a record of making life for Andi difficult. Plus, many of the characters believe that a person's core behavior can never change. It all ties into the classic fable that both Buffy and Bex mention in the episode, that being the tale of the scorpion who rides a frog's back to get across a river, but stings the frog halfway across anyway, despite the fact that they'll both drown, because the scorpion couldn't help what was in their nature. However, Andi shows by example in this story that a person's past actions should not prevent you from showing them some level of kindness. And this is actually a bold thing Andi does and makes her character actually a very strong role model for young viewers watching. In this day and age, way too many people of any age really can allow their feelings that come from being wronged by a person to cause them to become overly hostile to that person, to a point where they themselves become just as rude as the person that wronged them in the first place. Andi, however, takes the high road and chooses to treat Amber better than Amber treated her. It's obviously not easy for her, but Andi never once in the story says anything rude to Amber. Now, it can still be tricky showing kindness to those that have hurt you in the past. It is something that should always be approached delicately, since it is important to keep yourself safe from harm at all times. Which Amber unfortunately does to Andi when she encourages Andi to sneak out to a carnival with her, and when Andi is riding a Ferris wheel, Amber stops it after she notices Jonah is trying to call Andi and begins to yell at Andi for stealing Jonah away from her, and then she leaves Andi stuck in a compromising position that gets her in trouble with the police. Now, this unfortunate turn of events might cause one to believe that Amber was just playing Andi the entire time, and unfortunately, Amber's actions might cause one to start thinking that maybe people's behaviors cannot change. But here's the important mindset to have when dealing with difficult individuals. On one hand, you cannot control people's behaviors the way you control a puppet, because those person's behaviors and their choices are theirs and theirs alone. However, you can influence people's behaviors with your own. Now, in Amber's case, from what we learn about her family in this episode, it's easy to believe that her behavior is being influenced by her parents' behavior. At one point, her mom and dad were happy and kind to each other, but then at another point, they began doing harmful things to each other. So this may have created an unhealthy mindset in Amber's mind with the idea that people are always destined to do hurtful things to those that were once kind to them. However, Andi tried to be a positive influence on Amber in this episode. She showed kindness to Amber, hoping that her behavior could influence Amber's. Sadly though, it may not have. Now similarly, in the side plot of the episode, Buffy is having difficulty getting along with her basketball team captain because he's being rude to her. Now at first, Buffy feels that she should retaliate with being rude back, but Cyrus tries to help her realize that you can't influence people to be better that way. Now, like Andy, Buffy tries to show kindness to someone she herself is having a conflict with, but just like Andy, this conflict doesn't end well either. However, problems you have with anyone are like a brick wall. And even if you think you're perfect, it always takes two people to start building a wall of feuding. Andy and Buffy, however, in this episode, take action to get rid of their part of the metaphoric walls that they themselves contributed to in the past with those they were having a feud with. The individuals they were having issues with may have failed to take down their parts of the walls in this episode, but at least Andy and Buffy can feel a little better now, knowing that they at least did their part at trying to take that wall down and make things better.
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way.
In this episode of Andi Mack, we get a tale that is of mixed quality, but while being a slightly below average episode for the series, the story still does continue to convey very strong life lessons in this tale. The episode starts with a new school principal out of nowhere one morning giving all the students wristbands that divide them into two groups, Group A and Group B. Group A is given extensive privileges around the school, such as very nice food and easy schoolwork, while Group B is treated in a very underprivileged way, such as being given extensively difficult math work, disadvantages in gym class, and terrible food for their lunch. Now, it has to be said that this plot development just comes right out of nowhere. You see, most episodes of Andi Mack feature new plot developments that were either foreshadowed or tie into the series' overall greater narrative or the ongoing subplots. But just like the previous episode that featured the new school principal, this story does not tie in to the overall series narrative. It doesn't even tie into the subplot going on in the episode, that being Bex having to deal with her parents selling their old house and how she'll tell Andy about this. And while most episodes of Andi Mack have their multiple plots tie into each other thematically, these are two plots that pretty much have nothing to do with each other. But with all that being said, this out-of-nowhere plot is actually a decently well-done story with an actually powerful lesson. Now, it doesn't take too much thinking to realize that the social experiment in the story is a parallel for real-world racism and times in history when laws were in place to blatantly enforce separation of races and cultures and enforce inequality and economic disparity. And while there could have been a better story here if these concepts were addressed more directly, creating a scenario where any student of any race, culture, or background could have an equal chance of experiencing being privileged or underprivileged creates an interesting perspective for everyone here. For example, Andy at first knows she's being given special treatment. However, she's not quick to share her newfound wealth of extra goodies with her friends because she's enjoying them too much. And what the episode cleverly points out near the end of the episode is these privileges were not given based on students' grades or specific individual accomplishments. They were actually given out based on a system designed around the letters of everybody's given birth name, something they had no say in. But this ties into one of the life lessons of the episode, that being, no one should be given less opportunities than anyone else based on the circumstances of how they were born. The way you look, the name you have, and where you're from should not have an impact on how you're treated by people. However, sadly, that does occur in our world still. But the other life lesson this episode ties into is, if you are blessed enough to be very privileged, then share the benefits you have with others, which is demonstrated so well when Cyrus brings over the nice food that only Group A could receive in the cafeteria with the many starving, underprivileged individuals of Group B. A perfect example that shows how a system full of inequality can only be fixed when the privileged recognize what they have in abundance that others need and take steps to share what they have appropriately with others. The episode could even be seen as having political parallels here, as many of the Group A members eventually get very ticked off that their food is being shared with Group B, which can tie into how the rich just want to get richer and would even push for the government to make their lives better, but not show increased care for those in the middle or lower class. But even with all these great life lessons being so well told in this episode, the setup for this story is still a bit flawed, with a major issue here being no public school in America could get away with a social experiment this extensive. First off, it could be seen as causing emotional pain to many in the school, And second, giving such extensive privileges to half the students in the school could get the faculty in trouble and accused of doing the very thing they were trying to teach the students not to do in the first place. And also, you'd think Andi would be more appreciative now of what she has in life. However, the end of the episode ties back into the subplot of Bex having to explain her parents are selling their old house to Andi, which includes Andi's favorite backyard shack. Now yes, Andi does have an emotional attachment to the shack. However, having your own little shack is something most kids don't have. Thus, you'd think Andi, after going through such a humbling experience related to being privileged and underprivileged, would learn to accept this change well. But no, Andi gets upset like the entire main part of the episode didn't even happen. So yeah, not the best put together episode. As a piece to the series' overall narrative, this episode sticks out a bit as a below average episode. But except for the final scene, this story does stand out as a smart piece of entertainment that is above average when compared to most television that is on today. Thus, despite being a bit of an odd episode, this is still a must-see entry into this great series.
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way, all the way.
In the later episodes of Andi Mack Season 2, we begin to get stories, tales, and plotlines that were of mixed quality to some viewers, although one thing everyone can easily agree on when it comes to analyzing the rest of the show's second season is a greater amount of stories had their plotlines much more tied together than ever now. So from here on out, we'll be reviewing multiple episodes and plotlines all at once now, rather than analyzing the show just 1/2 hour at a time. Now, one of the big themes that begins to take over the second season of Andi Mack, starting with the episode Head Over Heels, is the focus on how negative things begin to happen in relationships when one bases their relationships and futures over assumptions alone. For example, in the aforementioned episode, Cyrus asks Bex to critique a screenplay that he's written. Bex, who automatically recognizes the screenplay as bad, lies to Cyrus and tells him it's good in order to not make him feel down. However, this just causes Cyrus to start building his future over Bex's false praises, which eventually only leads to his dreams crashing down when Bex finally does tell him the truth. Meanwhile, Buffy is beginning to act more like a girlfriend to her pal Marty, even though she has no intention of really dating him. To Buffy, it's all just a fun game of virtual romance and messing around with Marty, assuming that he views their relationship in the same way. But by the end of the episode, it's revealed that's not how Marty views their relationship. It turns out he does want Buffy and him to become a couple, but because she declines his advances, it only ends their friendship. Meanwhile, Andi thinks Jonah is really mad at her after he seems upset that she laughed at him when he fell down at one point during a game. Andi gets so caught up in worrying about Jonah's feelings that she eventually begins basing her entire relationship with Jonah over her assumptions on how Jonah feels, rather than how he actually says he feels. It's honestly an important lesson overall. One should never base their relationships or plans for the future around assumptions. You need to always communicate your intentions you have with others and make sure you clearly understand the feelings and intentions of those around you. However, even though Andi seems to learn this lesson at first, as the season progresses, it feels like she keeps forgetting this lesson. Because as the season moves on, Andi keeps jumping to more and more conclusions of how Jonah must view her, such as worrying he's interested in some other girls, and even jumping to the conclusion that Jonah did always view her as his girlfriend, when actually Jonah sort of didn't. He just wanted them to become real close friends, which definitely makes Andi feel pretty down. And this definitely results in the actors giving lots of great dramatic performances. But the thing is, they're performances that feel like they're repeating themselves, because the writers keep using the same story beats when it comes to Andi and Jonah's relationship of the will they won't they get together dynamic they keep having. But around the same time in a similar side plot, Bex becomes instant friends with a plant doctor named Miranda. The two seem like they're becoming really close real quick, until it's revealed Miranda is interested in dating Bowie, and she eventually starts doing so in a later episode, which causes Bex to experience some real mixed feelings. On one hand, she did say she did not want to marry Bowie, so she would assumingly be fine with someone else dating him. On the other hand, though, it's hinted and eventually revealed that Bex does still have feelings for Bowie and may have confused her feelings of not wanting to marry Bowie with her actual feelings of not being ready yet to do so. Unlike Andi and Jonah's relationship drama, which feels like it keeps retreading old ground, Beck's relationship drama here feels more legitimately needed for her character's journey, in the sense that Bex needs a shakeup in her relationship with Bowie in order to make her better contemplate what she really wants. And this sort of development does eventually sort of happen with Andi, when around the halfway point of the season, Andi meets a new guy named Walker, and she gets along with him very well and they start to hang out together a lot. However, within a few episodes, one can pretty much see that Walker was only around in the show to throw a wrench in and create some drama for Andi and Jonah's relationship, just long enough so as to make the goal of Andi and Jonah's finally becoming a couple seem more well-earned. Unlike Bex, who really does feel like she's going through some very realistically paced realization and understanding of what she wants with romance in this show, Andi and Jonah just feel like they're going through the motions of what most drama TV shows dictate needs to happen in a dramatic romantic story. Multiple times. But there still is plenty of other interesting dynamics that go on throughout the season with the rest of the characters, such as with Celia and her relationship with the rest of the family. You see, by the middle of the second season, Andi's been living with Bex for quite a while now, and Celia has finally moved away from being Andi's primary caregiver, which she was for the first 13 years of Andi's life, and now, not being Andi's mother figure, Celia this season finally gets to play with the role of just being a fun grandmother to Andi. It's actually an interesting scenario that grandparents and non-parental family members to children can really relate to. Being a parent and primary caregiver is difficult. So when you finally get to help care for a young family member and not have to be the primary provider, it opens up a sense of ease and relief with your assistant caregiving role, which Celia definitely has this season. She willingly bends her personality and behavior to whatever crazy stuff Andi wants to do now and doesn't really have to care as much about the consequences to her choices now. But Celia probably crosses a line in the episode There's a Mack in the Shack when she has Andi skip school so they can do a fun activity together. But after a somewhat bitter family moment, it's reminded that when you're an assistant caregiver, you still have to be careful with what you say and do to those you are helping provide care for. But to be fair, mistakes will be made when family members find themselves changing their roles, such as what's happened over the last year with the Mack family. But symbolized through the Mack women doing a dance class together at the end of the episode, viewers are reminded that relationships in family can only improve if you continue to communicate and spend time together. Meanwhile, Bowie gets some decent character development in a few stories. Before all of the relationship drama begins with Miranda, we get the episode A Good Hair Day, in which it's revealed that it's Bowie's birthday, but he doesn't want to celebrate it, and he actually hasn't celebrated it for years now. But it's when Beck starts probing and pushing at Bowie that Bowie reveals that he doesn't celebrate his birthday anymore since his dad had the same birthday as him, but died years ago. However, thanks to Beck's, Bowie eventually learns that just because you may have painful memories connected to a certain day of the year, it doesn't mean you can't make new, positive memories around it, which Bowie does when he finally attends a party his new family puts together for him. A party that ends with Andi finally calling Bowie her dad. It's a very special moment that, for Bowie, helps him move past the pain of losing his father years ago as he finally starts to create strong positive memories of being a father himself now. Meanwhile, as the season progresses, Cyrus begins to become more comfortable with being who he is now and explaining that to those around him. First, he politely explains to Iris that he doesn't like her in a romantic way, and the whole situation does end up working out alright. And then Cyrus finally becomes comfortable enough to explain to Andi that he likes Jonah. And it's a pretty decent scene that does show some good examples of warm and understanding friendship. Now, also around the same time this happens, we get some interesting insights into Buffy and her character growth. In one nice short story, we see Buffy being very competitive with Jonah in several games, which is very in character for her like always. But it's during a tug-of-war competition with Jonah that Buffy is finally questioned, why is she always so competitive? Resulting in Buffy explaining how she believes she has to always be strong because it's what her mom always told her to do before she was deployed in the army. And it's this moment that actually suddenly gives an explanation for why Buffy has acted the way she has throughout the series. Not having a parent for long periods of time would cause anyone to have to become more self-reliant than others, only Buffy took this to a greater extreme. But fortunately, the inner turmoil that Buffy has secretly been burying deep inside her related to being separated from her mom finally washes away in a very special scene when Buffy's mom finally returns home. It's an amazingly well done scene that perfectly captures the realistic feelings that family members that have been separated for a long time when reunited actually go through. And actress Sophia Wiley really nails this scene down incredibly well, with all the subtle things she does with her voice, her facial expressions, and her body language. It truly is a very touching scene. Which only makes it disappointing to say a lot of what happens in the next several episodes with Buffy feels like a waste of time. You see, Buffy's mom eventually tells Buffy that they have to move in about a week. So she, Andy, and Cyrus decide to make the most of their time together. This begins in the episode Perfect Day 2.0, in which the three try to recreate their younger childhood memories of what a perfect day feels like, only for everything to fall apart. However, the three eventually realize that a good day doesn't have to be a recreation of a good memory, because it's often very difficult to physically relive what you remember. Rather, it's better to make the most of your present versus trying to recreate something from the past that probably can't happen again. It's a pretty good message, really, and it would have been a great story to have right before Buffy moved away. Only, Buffy does not move away after this episode. Instead, we get a whole bunch of episodes that take Buffy's week before she moves and drags it out for way too long. And when Buffy does move away, she moves back in the next episode. Yeah, her mom just suddenly has a reason for them to move back, making a whole bunch of scenes and a whole bunch of episodes now just feel like a waste of time. It's like, why did we go through all that drama if everything was immediately just going to go back to the status quo? But let's just not discuss that anymore and talk about something else, like Jonah's character development this season. Like it's already been mentioned, Jonah and Andy had a lot of will they, won't they get together drama in this season. But when it gets to the point where Jonah starts to see Andy spending more time with another guy, it sends Jonah into his first panic attack. Now, to be clear, Jonah's panic attack scene is well portrayed. The scenes that revolve around Jonah having a panic attack are done with great realism and bring to light a very serious mental health issue to viewers that are watching. But that being said, Jonah had a panic attack just because he was jealous of Andy being with someone else? Is he that shallow? Now okay, Jonah is still young and is still trying to sort out his feelings. Emotions can be really tricky. Many teenagers out there do suffer from panic attacks from relationship drama they face. But again, shouldn't the fact that Jonah is having panic attacks just related to how jealous he is of Andy basically show that he's kind of shallow? It's like he's only really interested in Andy now that he sees some other guy moving in on his territory. That's kind of messed up. Although Jonah does do the smart thing and starts talking to someone about it, that being Bowie at his music store. And despite going to a professional being a better idea, Bowie does give Jonah some good advice in the sense that he gives Jonah a new hobby to get into, that being guitar playing. And productive hobbies can really help people that are dealing with mental stress. Although these scenes do bring up a little plot hole, such as, why is Bowie suddenly working at a music store? It just comes out of nowhere. Yeah, they later recognize that he suddenly switched jobs off screen, but it feels more like a plot patch than anything. And speaking of bad plots, in the episode Keep a Lid on It, Cyrus suddenly says he does not have feelings for Jonah anymore. So, what brought that on? It's never clearly said. Then Buffy has a verbal fight that's kind of out of character with Cyrus over him being friends with a fellow basketball player Buffy doesn't like, and then Buffy and Cyrus' friendship seemingly ends, only for them to get back together like right after, and then Buffy suddenly is revealed to have feelings for Jonah, which came right the heck out of nowhere, although maybe it could be with Walker, which comes out of nowhere, and then going back to Jonah, right as he and Andy look like they're truly about to become a real couple now, Jonah, just out of nowhere, suddenly has to leave her for a sports camp for 2 months that he's got to attend now, and ugh! What happened to this show? Okay, apologies if this review is starting to seem more like an angry rant now. It's just, Andi Mack during its first season was one of the best shows on television. Aside from stuff that happened in maybe 2 or 3 episodes, the first season of the show was practically perfect. But as the second season progressed, it just feels like that high quality has fallen apart with repeated character beats, filler material, a few plot inconsistencies, and plenty of overused drama cliches. But let's not focus on just the bad here. There still is some good stuff that happens in the last few episodes of the season. Despite having a great deal of episodes during the second season that feel like wasted material, Buffy does have a decent quick arc in the last 2 episodes of the season that feature her making peace with those that she used to be hostile with. And on top of that, all the adult characters get some great material in the last few episodes of the season as well. For example, Bex's father Ham has a quick character arc in which he decides that he wants to travel now because for years, he really hasn't done anything for himself. And Bowie has a great standout story in which he finally breaks up with Miranda after recognizing that she isn't the best mother in the world. At least, she isn't trying to be a much better mother right now in her life when compared to Bex. And speaking of Bex, everything that happens to her in this season actually feels very fleshed out and well-paced. For example, after graduating from a cosmetics school, Bex becomes a successful makeup artist and with help from her mom, starts her own business. And it's implied that these events lead to Bex becoming more confident in herself and thus becoming more comfortable with making bigger decisions now, such as her decision in the last episode of the season to ask Bowie to marry her. And before anyone points out how weird it is for Bex to be proposing to Bowie, one, it's 2018 and it's not as big a deal for a woman to propose marriage to a man now. And two, with Bex already denying Bowie's marriage proposal in the first episode of the season, it would make sense for Bex to take the initiative now. Bex said no when Bowie asked her, so for all he knows, Bex still is not interested and may never be interested. So Bex has to be the one to initiate the proposal now. But at the same time Bex plans to ask Bowie, Bowie is asked by his rock band friends to go on a 6-month tour with them. The season ends with Bowie uncertain of if he wants to go with them, and with Bex being uncertain now if she wants to ask Bowie a question that might persuade him to give up his dreams. What happens next? We'll look at that when we begin analyzing the 3rd season of this series. Andi Mack Season 2 is a mixed bag this time around. On one hand, the actors are great, and some of the episodes contain really smart television. On the other hand, after the first few episodes, this is the season that starts to feel like it's going through the motions of what makes good drama, rather than being just good drama, period. Andi and Jonah's will they, won't they romance plot may have captivated the emotions of younger viewers, but any older viewers that have seen a sizable chunk of drama television in their lives will feel the contrived nature of these plots. Plus, we get plots that lead to nothing, such as Cyrus being interested in Jonah, and Buffy's long drawn-out moving away storyline. Now, it's been reported this season wound up being longer than it was originally planned to be when it first started, due to Disney increasing the episode count after filming was underway. So, it would seem that the writers of the series were in a bit of a crunch and had to create a bunch of filler seemingly under the gun. So there can be some sympathy here for not as great stories this season around. But that being said, Andi Mack in its 2nd season is still one of the best dramas on television. It may not be as consistently solid as season 1, but the series still continued to be the best current family show on television. It continued to feature characters dealing with real-world issues and addressing those many issues in a relevant and mature way with its characters, played by one of the best ensemble casts on television. And yeah, if I had to give a Medal of Acting award this season to someone, it would again be Leland Bowden. She just fits like a glove with Bex's character, and no scene with her has anything close to bad in it. The way she portrays this young adult character, slowly maturing and learning to be a better person overall, is one of the best performances on television. Although if I had to list 2 runner-ups this season, it would have to go to Sophia Wiley and Trent Garrett. For Sophia Wiley, she just seems to have an extra spark to her this season, and does a great job at showcasing many emotions this season while still being able to be a bit subtle. And Trent Garrett does a great job every minute he's on screen, portraying a flawed, but still role model father-like character. But again, this is one of the best ensemble casts on television, and no one is bad here. And despite the flaws of this season, this show is still worth watching for any families out there, because there is plenty of amazing discussion material that can stem from watching this show together. What kind of discussions and stories will stem from the show's 3rd season? Only time will tell.
There ain't no map to follow, but I'm with you all the way, all the way.
Andi Mack Season 3, the final season of this beloved family television series, gives us one final set of episodes that, while of mixed quality at times, does manage to stick the landing in the end in the ways that matter most. Now, just like the second half of the show's 2nd season, Andi Mack Season 3 is mostly filled with ongoing plots rather than standalone episodes or single stories that say a lot on their own. So, for this final installment of our look back at the series, we'll be delving into the final season as a complete whole.
The season starts out with an entire summer passing between the season 2 finale and the start of this one, meaning story-wise, we finally get a chance to give the characters a break and evolve a bit off-screen before catching up with them again. In some ways, this is a good choice. Around the early episodes, we see that a summer apart from Jonah has finally allowed Andi to see the obvious, that all of their back and forth romance craziness means that they probably shouldn't be a couple. However, meanwhile, we suddenly learn Buffy and Walker are dating. Okay, well, like I said, an entire summer passed off screen, so all sorts of stuff could have happened to lead up to this. But the thing is, a lead character starting to date another character off screen can make the audience feel like they've been cheated. Viewers want to see characters make important life choices, and to not see this one start just feels odd. However, one important life choice we do see in the first episode of this season is that Bex and Bowie have definitely decided to get married. Yes, Bowie, who was on his tour with his rock band, decides to leave the tour early because he can't wait any longer to be with Bex and finally be engaged to her. It's actually a really nice scene, and honestly, Bex and Bowie together easily become the entertainment highlight of this season. For example, they're engaged now, so emotionally speaking, they're feeling happier than they've ever felt before in their lives, and just really enjoy spending any time together. And just completely honestly speaking here, Bex and Bowie are just so darn cute together. They sort of act like kids that have just fallen in love, but rather than showing irresponsible thoughts and immaturity like some young couples do, they're instead filled with a better patience, tolerance, and mature devotion to the other. It really shows that age and experience really does help one better understand what love is. Now yeah, they still disagree and argue about simple little things, mostly sitcom-like shenanigans that happen.
Did you use my overpriced peppermint shampoo as body wash?
Was that wrong?
But they constantly resolve things quickly. There's even a super sweet story where Andi and Bex show they're hesitant to change their last names once Bex marries Bowie. So Bowie decides he'll change his last name when he gets married to Bex. Again, Bex and Bowie are just so adorable together, and they are the flippin' best part of this season.
Bowie!
What?
I'm trying to do yoga! Turn it up! Thank you!
And thankfully, the extended family begins to get along a lot better too. For example, there's a great episode called Cookie Monster, where Bowie's mom, Cookie, finally shows up, and we get a wonderful series of scenes where Andi finally gets to know her other grandmother and bond with her. And during that, we also get a subplot with Bex's mom, Celia, now excitedly helping plan for Bex and Bowie's wedding, including a very entertaining scene where Bex and Celia share the news with Bex's aunt and cousin. Oh my gosh, because actress Lauren Tom was... Okay, you know what? I'm not going to explain that joke. You either get it or you don't. However, the one weak link in the Mack family dynamic here is the title character of the show, Andi. While everyone else begins to bond closer and show greater maturity than ever, during the first half of the season, Andi kind of shows backwards character development. Like, for example, Andi gets mad at Bex when Bex and Celia go wedding dress shopping without her. It's not your wedding, Andi. Celia, in theory, deserves to have some input as the mother who helped raise Bex, but you, Andi, are not in a position to make decisions for your mother. Get over it. And this is just a small part of what's wrong with Andi during this season. Most notably, early in season 3, Andi begins to have a hard time hanging out with Buffy because she's dating Walker now. Now, in theory, this is because it is hard for Andi to deal with Buffy dating her ex. But wait, Andi and Walker never started dating. They were just friends that considered being more than that at one point. But because Walker hangs out with Cyrus and Jonah too, Andi stops hanging out with all of them for a while and begins hanging out more with Amber, who honestly is behaving a lot better this season, but still is not the best person for Andi to be hanging out with all the time. However, it all ends with Buffy and Walker breaking up because Buffy suddenly just doesn't feel like dating him anymore. Well, I mean, teenagers do go through sudden mood swings at times, but why did Buffy not want to date Walker anymore? Well, I guess it's hard to tell because we never really understood why they started dating in the first place. But luckily, in the end, Andi and Buffy become good gal pals again, and all the friends are happy together again, meaning the entire story arc of Buffy dating Walker was a complete waste of time. Man, I just realized the show's writers are not having a good track record with handling Buffy's character, are they? However, one good ongoing plot with Buffy is her leading the school's first all-girls basketball team. Naturally, Buffy has to better understand the concepts of humility, teamwork, and good sportsmanship while doing this, and it results in her becoming a bit more mature herself. Meanwhile, with Cyrus, we get a handful of stories and plots here and there this season, which are handled quite well. It's mostly just fun standalone side stories with him, including a bunch of scenes where he begins to bond with Amber and one of his fellow schoolmates, TJ. They're a decent duo together, and thankfully Cyrus's friendship with TJ helps everyone else see that TJ isn't as rough as he seems at first glance. Nearly every side story involving them is just standalone episodes, but you do see them over time becoming closer friends. We'll talk more about them near the end because there's not too much deep stuff to say right now. But no, the actual deeper stuff with Cyrus and TJ is what happens in the situations surrounding them. For example, there's a story where Cyrus and TJ meet a kid who plays around with a gun, and we actually get a pretty good straightforward story that's still effective at telling kids a great message about gun safety. And then there's the episode Once in a Minion. The story revolves around the characters actually meeting up at the Shiva for Cyrus's grandmother, the traditional Jewish mourning period for the loss of a loved one. It's actually a very, very solid story where the characters discuss and open up about being true to yourself and not waiting to tell the people the things that you've wanted to tell them for some time, since you never know how much time you'll actually have left with them, resulting in Cyrus finally coming out to the last person in his friendship circle he hadn't to yet, Jonah.
That's your classic bagel and lox. That's gefilte fish. Skip that. And I'm gay. Yeah? Okay, cool. Cool.
It's actually a very poignant moment. It's simple, but an extremely effective scene between Cyrus and Jonah. But speaking of just Jonah, yeah, he's not handled too well this season. He still has a great actor that keeps his character interesting, but Jonah, well, let's back up a bit. He starts the season off acting like he's secretly still pining for Andi, but then the show finally has him move on, and he gets a new girlfriend, Libby, who is deaf actually. And through the episodes involving Libby, we actually get some really, really well-handled scenes that represent the deaf community very appropriately, and even show through example why it's important to try to learn new forms of communication other than texting, because face-to-face communication is still very important to us all. But then, Jonah breaks off with Libby off-screen, and then decides to start dating Amber again off-screen, for reasons that are not clearly given. Okay, Amber does say later that she and Jonah got back together because they're both dealing with similar hardships. You see, both Amber and Jonah have families that have fallen on hard economic times. Jonah's admission to his family problems is actually a very well-handled scene. But then Jonah and Amber realize they don't click together now, but Amber is really liking Jonah anyway for reasons. But then Amber realizes Jonah isn't into labels and wants to break up with him, and suddenly we realize we've been thrown into a badly written teen romance drama tale. And look, I don't mean to keep bashing on how parts of this show are not well handled, but well, it gets a bit bothersome because other parts of the show are extremely well handled. Like with Bex and Bowie, for example, in the second half of the season. You see, after being messed with a bit mentally by Bowie's ex in one episode, Bex starts to have doubts on whether she wants to marry Bowie. Not because she does not love him, but because Bex and Bowie have finally found a point in their relationship where everything feels perfect, and Bex is afraid that changing any context of their relationship now could rock the boat too much, so to speak. It's honestly a great commentary on young adult culture now. So many young adults in this day and age desire for everything in their lives to be seemingly perfect now, whether it be how their homes are designed or how their marriage looks. And for some people, they feel if there is just a small chance they can't have a perfect marriage, then they shouldn't get married at all. The concept of marriage can be very scary for many young adults. It's a lifelong commitment, a commitment that, if broken, will leave much more pain in one's life versus if they don't get married to begin with. But the thing is, Bex and Bowie do love each other, and they do want what's best for the other. Marriage is more than just their excuse to cuddle together in bed, but it's their way of publicly declaring that they will love, stand by, and support only the other and their family in all ways, shapes, and forms for the rest of their life. And they both know there is no one else that they would rather make that life choice with. But Bowie does respect Bex, and he does not want her to do something that she is not comfortable doing, because that's what you do when you love someone. But Bex eventually realizes Bowie does indeed want to marry her, so she's left conflicted because she does not want Bowie to feel deprived of being married to her, because helping your partner's dream come true is what you do when you love someone. Now you got that? That is an example of good complex writing. It's a situation where there's not a clear solution to the problem, and the problem itself is not born of a single antagonist causing trouble, but rather born from circumstances made by multiple characters, multiple life choices. The problem with other storylines in Andi Mack, though, is that rather than be complex, they're just complicated. What makes complicated plots different than complex is complicated plots just involve new problems just showing up. Take Jonah's complicated plot lines in the show, for example. Jonah is introduced dating Amber, but because of her behavior, he breaks up with her and then gets together with Andi. But then the two realize that dating is not what they thought it'd be, so they stop being a couple. But then Andi hangs out with Walker and Jonah gets jealous. But then the sort of love triangle ends when Jonah sings a song to Andi and gets together with her. But then Jonah leaves to go to summer camp, which results in the two breaking up. But then Jonah starts dating a new girl, but then they break up off screen. But then Jonah gets together with Amber, but then he realizes they don't want to be a couple, and, well, you see the problem here? Every time you say "but then," you do not have a complex story. You're just having a crazy complicated tale. It's like someone stirring a whole new ingredient in an already fine-tasting dish. In contrast, look at Bex's development throughout the show. It's revealed in episode 1. She is Andi's mother and has a lot of growth and maturity that she's got to get through in order to become the mom that she should have been but wants to be now, which results in her becoming more engaged in Andi's day-to-day activities, which results in her slowly becoming more mature and understanding, which results in reaching out to Andi's father Bowie, which results in her rekindling her romance with Bowie, which results eventually in her getting back together with Bowie, which results in all sorts of memories, both positive ones and feelings of uncertainty coming to the surface, which results in her and Bowie not completely sure if they want to get married. You see the difference there? Everything that happened to Bex in the series was a result of previous actions and choices she made. Considering who the characters were and all of the backstories eventually given, everything that happened to Bex was the natural outcome to what she had done before. However, every decision Bex had to make in the show was still a difficult one, because there would be hardships with any choice she made. That is good, complex writing. However, a lot of the rest of the season becomes just a bunch of complicated narrative stalls before we reach the somewhat natural narrative conclusion for a lot of the characters' journeys. For example, Buffy starts hanging out with her old friend Marty again in the hopes of getting together with him. But then we learn Marty has a girlfriend right before the series finale. Okay, so now we have some love triangle tension, and it ends when Marty's new girlfriend breaks up with him right after she's introduced. Yeah, that's the definition of a narrative stall. Then meanwhile, TJ starts hanging out with some mean new girl named Kira, which is a result of TJ's kind behavior and his desire to hang out with a fellow basketball player. But then it turns out Kira is trying hard to keep TJ away from Cyrus because she's bad. Only for TJ to not want to hang out with her anymore, allowing for him to get closer with Cyrus just in time for the series finale, meaning everything with Kira was just another narrative stall. And meanwhile, Andi does a really big art project that gets a lot of positive attention from people, which is a result of her art talents that she's always displayed throughout the series. But then Bex tries to entice Andi to apply to a private school. Okay, this might seem natural, but why didn't this natural development happen sooner in the series, considering Andi has always displayed above average artistic talents? And then this results in Andi becoming all uncertain of what she wants to do, just like she's been really uncertain of how to do a lot of other things throughout the series. But then in the series finale, Andi suddenly becomes not uncertain and decides to go to the art school. So Andi finally comes across as more confident and mature, just in time for the end of the series. Okay, seriously, the long stall we had to get to this point in Andi's maturity took even way longer than the others. But the two characters whose growth never felt forced or stalled was Bex and Bowie, who ironically get the conclusion to their journey in the second to last episode of the series, A Moving Day. In this penultimate episode, things start off pretty simple enough. Actually, it starts off more like a sitcom plot. Beck says she's won tickets to get a free meal from some famous chef who lives in the mountains. So she gets Bowie, Andy, and her mom Celia to drive up to the snowy mountains, and all sorts of silly hijinks occur. Celia becomes almost unbearable with how she begins the journey and how she drives the car. There's some whining along the way, and there's a long uphill climb to their destination. The uphill journey is obviously very long and difficult for everyone. But then, when they make it to the top, it's not a famous chef that's up there to meet them. It's an outdoor wedding ceremony that Bex has prepared for her and Bowie. The journey that started off with one kind of shocking surprise appropriately ends with an even greater type of surprise. And it's actually very appropriate that Bex brought Andy and Celia on her and Bowie's mountain hike with them. The walk that the family took up the mountain was symbolic. It was an uphill struggle, just like Bex and Bowie's journey throughout the show was an uphill struggle. But they couldn't have made it without their family, hence why the family took the uphill walk with them. Rebecca Bex Mack did indeed experience an incredible saga of growth and maturity throughout the series, but she never went through it alone. She experienced and got help in her long journey from her daughter, her mother, and even sometimes her daughter's friends, who are also there at the wedding. And so finally, after such a long journey in more ways than one, Bex and Bowie have finally both reached the appropriate point where they're finally ready to get married, surrounded by their closest loved ones, in an adorable and emotionally powerful scene that, when seen by fans when it first aired, did not leave a dry eye in the house. Complete with Jonah singing Bowie's song he wrote for Bex on the guitar, and humorously enough, Andy's phone goes off in the middle of the wedding, but it honestly acts as the perfect metaphor for how no family is perfect, but they can still move forward and love each other. The scene is honestly the emotional pinnacle of the series, and is simply an amazing tribute to the power of the human spirit, and how patience, kindness, perseverance, and love can change people and families for the better. And honestly, this is the moment that the series should have ended on. Andi Mack's final season is obviously a mixed bag in terms of quality. In many respects, it concludes with the characters ending up where they did indeed belong, it just took a little too long to get there. Buffy, for example, started the series off being very overconfident and overcompetitive, and throughout the first season and the first half of season 2, she was beginning to see why she was like this and how her personality was hurting relationships with people around her. So the natural next step in her growth was to finally be ready to be a little more emotionally vulnerable and allow herself to open up to people more. But instead, the show had to stall for that natural next step by having Buffy suddenly have to move away, and then not, and then date Walker, and then not. Now, the way Buffy eventually, in the end, gets together with Marty feels perfectly natural. It's just there was too many roadblocks to get there. Cyrus, meanwhile, had a much more satisfying character journey. Now, unlike the other characters, almost every story with Cyrus was standalone, or just lasted 2 or 3 episodes. But collectively, all of his stories did weave together to be a much stronger narrative. Cyrus started the series off very nervous and uncertain of pretty much everything he did. In fact, while it is not said explicitly, one reason why Cyrus may have not had any male friends before the series began was because of how insecure he was with his masculinity. But after he learned he could be a positive, productive member of society in his own unique way, he became more confident. Not just confident in how he came out to his peers, but also with trying new things, like standing up for TJ and seeing how great a guy he was when no one else would. And before anyone asks, there's honestly not much to say about Cyrus and TJ. They're a great duo together, but all of their scenes together before the series finale just showed they had a very good friendship. But because the fans demanded it, they became more than friends in the series finale. Now, that's fine. Friendships can grow into something more, and if fans thought they saw it was already developing before that point, that's their opinion. It's just there was no overt sign of it ahead of time versus what all of the other couples got in the show. Now, them getting together obviously means a lot to certain groups of people, but the one thing everyone can take out of this finale is that Cyrus, in the end, became a lot more comfortable with who he is and what he wants to do with his life. Jonah, meanwhile, went through the exact reverse of this kind of growth. When Jonah is first introduced, he's portrayed as being too good to be true. He's the real nice and real confident boy that many are attracted to. But As the series progressed, we slowly saw Jonah's confidence unravel. He didn't have his life as together as it might have seemed at first glance, and he wasn't as certain about things as he originally thought he was. And this by itself is not a bad story to tell. Many young people think the seemingly popular people at school have no worries or troubles in their lives, when in reality they do. And the sad truth is, as you get older and begin to slowly enter the adult world, you unfortunately realize you didn't know as much about the world as you first thought you did. And actor Asher Angel actually does a great job at portraying a young teen who is slowly starting to lose his grip and his confidence. The problem is, it would have been really nice to see Jonah rebuild his confidence from a much more mature and appropriate standpoint. Sure, he did develop better bonds with those around him by the end, and his character did show you can be broken but still have good friendships. But by the series finale, Jonah was still bad at romance and still pretty nervous at times. His final noteworthy scene in the series is him and Andi not getting back together, thank goodness, but wondering what would have happened if they met when they were older. And yeah, things might have been different if they met at a more mature point in their lives. But it's hard to imagine that because we never got a chance to really see Jonah get much more mature. And Andi, yeah, she was never the most mature throughout the series. She was just along for the ride as crazy things happened to her. She got excited for stuff that happened to other people around her often, and she would try to encourage people to do things that the fans wanted to see happen, but that made her more of an audience surrogate character than a series lead. She did have her good dramatic moments from time to time, although she also had her whining moments often too, which did not help. But she was probably most effective when she was interacting with her family. And yeah, let's talk about the rest of the Mack family, who were honestly the stronger part of the show. Celia started the series out with a very specific and rigid idea of how her daughter and granddaughter should live their lives, but upon better understanding their perspective and how hard they were trying to grow, began to loosen up and became more open-minded and fun-loving. And actress Lauren Tom did a great job at portraying Celia's journey throughout the series. She was excellent at nailing Celia's more serious, cynical side early in the series, and was great near the show's end when Lauren Tom's portrayal of Celia began to feel more like, well, Lauren Tom. Bowie, meanwhile, had a great story of growth too. What made him a different kind of character for television was he was basically a really nice guy from start to finish. Only he had to learn the right way to be a nice guy. Basically, Bowie always had good intentions. He just had to learn the right way to carry out those intentions properly. But you could always see why Bex was attracted to him. He was never perfect, but always tried to do right. And in the end, isn't that what matters most? And yeah, let's talk about Bex now. Easily the best character in the series. Now, when the show first began, Bex was portrayed as being a little too carefree. She didn't just pretend to be Andi's older sister. Maturity-wise, she was just an older sister. Bex was a fun person to be around, but didn't fully understand responsibility and maturity. Throughout the course of the series, though, she became an incredibly responsible and mature individual. First, she owned up to being Andi's mother. Then she took steps to being engaged in the many areas of Andi's personal life. Then she got a job. Then she attempted to raise Andi and own a home all on her own. Then she began her own business. Then became confident enough to want to marry Bowie. And then finally, they got married. Bex is the definition to what good character growth looks like. She started in a rough, undesirable place, something many viewers can unfortunately relate to, but through many realistically made choices viewers themselves could make too if they had to, Bex eventually brought herself to a place in her life any viewer watching could respect. And that's not just good television we're talking about anymore. That's an effective way to tell a story that teaches people that they too can pick up the pieces of a messed up situation they're in and rebuild their lives for the better. And of course, Bex was brought to life by actress Leland Bowden, who was honestly perfect for this role. Just the facial expressions and body language from her at times said more than her words. But when she did talk, you always felt like you were hearing a real human being speak from their mind and soul, and not a script. What Leland Bowden and all of the directors and writers did with Bex was something that cannot be duplicated. In fact, Rebecca Bex Mack may just be one of the most important and special characters in all of fiction. The story of Bex is essentially one of the most inspiring stories of all time. And so there you go, Andi Mack. Was it a perfect series? Absolutely no. Is it still a series that anybody should watch? Absolutely yes. The strengths and positives that come from watching this show easily outweigh the flaws and negatives. And maybe that's an appropriate thing to take out of this series. Andi Mack was not a perfect show, just like its characters weren't perfect, but there was still a lot of good that came from them. Just like any of us. No human being is perfect, but there's still plenty of good that can come out of any flawed person, if we try hard and give it our all the way.